Do you think time heals all wounds, or some never close?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? My own mother told me, over the phone, that the trust my grandmother left had been given to my stepsister instead of me, because she was worth it and I was not. Those were her exact words, delivered like she was reading off a grocery list. I sat there with the phone pressed to my ear, trying not to let my voice crack, and I answered with the calmest thing I could think of, "Thanks for telling me." I knew if I let even 1 ounce of anger show, she would twist it into proof that she made the right choice. Hanging up, I felt like I had been erased, but I also knew that her little announcement had given me exactly what I needed. I had been prepared for years, even if I did not fully realize it until that moment. My grandmother had trusted me with her medical paperwork when I was still in college, and I had scanned every single document she signed into a folder on my cloud drive. I had the original trust papers, the amendment she added when she remarried, and even the letter she wrote me saying that this was meant to give me stability in life, education, health, housing, nothing extravagant. She specifically wrote that no one who benefited from the trust should also control it, because she had lived through fights in her own family and wanted to avoid that disaster. My mother either forgot or thought I had lost those files. She was wrong. I replayed the call in my head and typed it out word for word while it was still fresh. Every insult, every declaration that Haley deserved it, every cutting pause. I dated the transcript, saved it in the same folder, and backed it up twice. Then I drafted a short, factual email to the bank officer listed in the trust. Nothing dramatic. Just, I have reason to believe the trust distributions are not being administered according to the written terms. I request a freeze on all outgoing payments and a full accounting. I attached the scanned trust and the amendment, then sent it certified. My finger hovered over the mouse for a second, because this was the kind of step you could not walk back from, but I clicked anyway. Within minutes, the confirmation receipt landed in my inbox. That night, instead of calling anyone in the family or screaming into a pillow, I called someone else. Years earlier, I had volunteered at a mentorship clinic for first-generation students. The director there once introduced me to a local judge who helped with pro bono work. I found her number and asked, very plainly, if she knew an attorney who could handle trust petitions. She gave me a name, told me to use her as a reference, and I wrote it down carefully. I did not cry on the phone, and I did not vent. I just took the information and said thank you. The next morning, I woke up to a subject line that made my chest tighten: Notice of Distribution Freeze. The bank had suspended all withdrawals and scheduled an internal review. It was polite, neutral, full of formal language, but what it meant was clear: the money could not move until they finished digging. Valerie must have seen it around the same time, because my phone lit up with her name in the middle of a staff meeting. I let it ring. I let it go to voicemail. She called again and again, and then Haley started texting, each message more frantic than the last. I turned the phone face down and focused on my work emails. By the time I got home, I had 3 voicemails from my mother, each one angrier than the last. She accused me of betrayal, of selfishness, of trying to destroy the family. She said my grandmother would be ashamed of me. I played each message once, calmly, then forwarded them to my secure email account and saved them in the same folder. I did not reply, not a single word. Silence was my answer. That night, as I sat with a cup of tea, I realized something. For years, I had been treated like the backup daughter, the one who should not ask for too much, the one who was told to be grateful for leftovers. But now, for the first time, I had the leverage. Not because I screamed, not because I begged, but because I had receipts, patience, and the willingness to act when it mattered. The following day, an email arrived from the law firm the mentorship director recommended. It included a calendar invite with a case number attached. Seeing that number made my pulse jump. This was no longer just a family squabble. It was official. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen, and I thought about what Valerie must be doing at that exact moment. Maybe yelling at Richard, maybe blaming Haley, maybe drafting another vicious voicemail. None of it mattered. The money was frozen. The documents were filed. And she had no idea how much more I had already prepared. The truth is, I had not planned for war, but once she declared it, I knew exactly how to fight. with paperwork, with timing, with silence when she wanted screams. When I said, "Thanks for telling me," I meant it. Because by opening her mouth, she gave me the very thing that would undo her. The money stopped moving, and Valerie realized I wasn't bluffing. By the time the freeze email had done a full lap through my mother's contacts and Haley's followers, the version of me walking around in other people's phones was a cartoon villain with a calculator for a heart. And even though a very loud part of me wanted to jump into the noise and swat down every lie one by one, I forced myself to keep breathing, open my laptop, and build something steadier than outrage. Because I have learned that the only way to cut through a fog of gossip is to keep it painfully simple, unbearably factual, and absolutely free of the drama the other side craves like candy. I wrote a single message to the family list, and I kept my voice so calm that it almost sounded boring, which was exactly the point, because boring is terrifying to people who depend on chaos to get their way. I laid out a clean timeline with quiet dates and plain English. I attached a scan of the specific clause that barred any beneficiary from acting as trustee, and I pasted the bank's notice about suspended distributions. Then I pressed send and closed the lid. Since there was nothing to add, and no insult worth answering, and within an hour the replies began to arrive in that familiar blend of concern flavored with accusation, including a cousin who said I should have handled it privately, and an aunt who wrote that my grandmother always loved harmony, and a neighbor of my mother's who somehow got included and suggested prayer, while Valerie sent a private volley telling me that legal paperwork cannot fix character defects, which I ignored. Not because her words did not sting, but because I had chosen the rhythm of this fight, and she did not get to change the tempo. At work, I walked into my manager's office and told her the situation in one sitting, without tears and without cover stories, and I said there might be noise online for a short stretch, and I would step back from public events if she preferred. But my manager looked at me with that steady work face I have come to trust and said that transparency is what matters here, not performance, and that HR would note it and move on, and then she asked if I needed time off, which I declined, because routine felt like oxygen, and because I wanted this conflict to live only where it belonged, which was in documents, not in my day. While I tried to get through a stack of reports, my phone started to hum with a different kind of chaos, the practical fallout kind, as a venue called to confirm that a card on file had failed for a deposit tied to Haley's new project. And the manager on the line sounded confused and a little embarrassed, and when he asked for the account contact on the trust, which was listed as me, I told him that the fund was under a temporary freeze and that any contract signed during a review could expose his business to a chargeback mess he did not need, and the man, who did not care about our family drama at all, thanked me in a voice that said he absolutely did not want a chargeback mess, and he promised to hold the date without payment until things were clear. Which is how I knew the freeze was not just a line in an email, but a real lock on a real door that used to open for one person's convenience, whenever she wanted to play grown-up with other people's money. That little lock echoed in the oddest places, because later that afternoon a boutique called about an heirloom bracelet my mother had recently gifted to Haley as a symbolic celebration of a new chapter, and the clerk, who sounded young and careful, said there was a discrepancy in the payment trail because the item had been purchased with funds that referenced the trust, and the store had a compliance note about avoiding entanglements with frozen accounts, and would I mind confirming the status. So I pulled up the receipt copy that I had saved years ago when my grandmother first had the piece resized. I did the math in my head about when it would have been swapped, and I sent the clerk the freeze letter and the clause about proper use. And within minutes the manager called back to apologize and explain that they would reverse the transfer and hold the piece for safekeeping until the trustee gave written instructions, which felt like a small, quiet restoration, not because I wanted shiny things, but because history belongs where it was loved and paid for honestly, and I was done watching it get moved like props in a show. Of course, the moment that happened, the tone in Valerie's messages shifted from righteous to panicked, since her usual levers were sticking, and when a person who relies on speed and intimidation hits a patch of dry sand, you can hear the engine burn. So I sat there and listened to it whine without touching the throttle, and I let the hiss of incoming texts play like static while I kept my own hands still, because I have learned that restraint can be the loudest sound in a room full of people who expect you to flail. That evening I sent one more message, and it was not to the family. I emailed the bank officer again, attached a simple, unadorned log of new attempts to spend, noted the merchant conversations and the boutique reversal, and asked that these be included in the accounting file, because I wanted a paper trail that did not depend on my mother's memory or my stepsister's stories. And then I turned off my phone, heated leftovers, and let myself be boring for one whole hour, which felt like a rebellious act in a household culture that has always measured worth in drama per minute. The next morning brought a fresh angle of attack, which is the social media version of a kitchen knife, as Haley posted a breathless story about being robbed by a jealous sister who hates to see other women shine. And she captioned it with an inspirational quote about abundance, and she tagged a few local influencers who are usually 2 bad days away from an apology video, and although every fiber in my body pushed me toward a rebuttal, I remembered the rule I wrote on a sticky note and stuck to my monitor on the first night: do not feed the beast, feed the file. So I copied the links into an email to the bank and to my attorney contact, and then I closed the tabs before my pulse could pick up speed. Somewhere between lunch and the end of the day, a quiet ding on my laptop cut through the noise, and there it was, a calendar invitation from a law firm I did not recognize paired with a case caption that I absolutely did. Because attached to it was a number assigned by the court, not by a family thread, and the subject line held the kind of weight that makes you sit a little straighter even if you are alone in your kitchen. I stared at it long enough for the screen to dim, and then I clicked. Except, since this is what happens when you choose paper over performance, and for the first time since the phone call where my mother told me I was not worth it, I felt the ground under me stop shifting, because the room we were heading into had rules that did not bend for volume or tears. That afternoon, a law firm emailed me a calendar invite with a case number I recognized immediately. When the case number appeared in my inbox, I knew we had crossed the invisible line where family quarrels stop being whispers and start becoming part of a record that strangers in robes and suits would read, dissect, and decide upon. Which is exactly why I did not allow myself to feel either relief or panic, because both would have distracted me from the fact that the trust was no longer just a weapon of favoritism, but now an official matter under court review. And the first thing I did was forward every scanned document, every certified letter receipt, and every voicemail to the attorney recommended by the mentorship director, a woman named Helen Price, who spoke in calm paragraphs and made it clear that paper is both sword and shield if you know how to use it. Helen explained that the fastest way to drag sunlight into the mess was to file a petition compelling a full accounting of the trust and a motion to appoint a neutral trustee, which sounded so technical that I almost laughed. Because beneath the jargon was a much simpler truth. My mother could no longer move money in the dark, and Haley could not keep living like the world was her personal open bar. We drafted the petition with nothing more dramatic than the actual language of the trust itself, highlighting the clause forbidding beneficiaries from acting as trustees, pointing to the clear language that only written instructions from my grandmother counted as valid amendments, and attaching the letter my grandmother had written me years ago that underlined in her own words that this was meant to give me stability, not entertainment for anyone else. The first response from my mother's side landed like a splash of ink across a clean page, an affidavit signed by her, claiming that my grandmother had given her verbal permission to redirect the funds toward Haley because she believed Haley showed more promise. Helen did not even blink at that argument. She simply circled the part of the trust that required written directives only and pointed out that this so-called affidavit was notarized by a man who just happened to be one of Richard's longtime co-workers, which gave us more than enough ground to file a challenge for defective notarization. She told me that sloppy paperwork is often a sign of desperation, and while it looked official on the surface, underneath it was as fragile as tissue. Haley, predictably, did not limit her campaign to affidavits. She went online, blasting out posts about how her jealous sister had stolen the money meant for her future, dressing it all in empowerment language as if this were a story about keeping women down instead of about honoring a legal document. The posts were shared, screenshotted, and reposted in corners of the internet where nuance goes to die. I refused to answer even once. Instead, I saved the links, sent them to the bank officer with a short note asking that they be included in the evidence file, and forwarded them to Helen with the subject line, "Potential reputational harm." She told me to keep doing exactly that. No online replies, only archived proof. At work, the fallout felt like a shadow at the edge of my desk because colleagues inevitably caught whispers or saw a stray post, and I knew the only way to keep it from infecting my reputation there was to get ahead of it. I drafted a letter of explanation, not to spread details, but to make sure leadership understood the basics, that I was involved in a trust dispute, that inaccurate things might appear online, and that I did not want them blindsided. To my surprise, instead of distancing themselves, the executive director called me in and handed me a letter she had drafted for the court, praising my years of service, integrity, and attention to detail in handling resources. That letter ended up becoming an exhibit, a rare piece of support that carried more weight than all of my mother's accusations combined, because credibility outside the family circle is currency you cannot fake. By the time our first court date arrived, the air between us was already thick with hostility. My mother entered with a smile plastered on her face, the kind she always used at church socials when she wanted to pretend everything was perfect, but I could see the edge in her eyes. Haley, meanwhile, looked restless, like she expected to stand up and give a speech about how unfair life was. None of that mattered, because the judge had already read the filings. The clerk called the case, and within minutes, Helen presented our motion to appoint a neutral trustee. She spoke calmly, laid out the defective notarization, and reminded the court that the trust explicitly disallowed verbal modifications. The other side tried to interrupt, claiming urgency and family context, but the judge cut through it with one question: where was the written directive? There was silence. The affidavit could not stand on its own, not with a suspicious notarization, and not with a trust that made it crystal clear that words spoken in kitchens or whispered over hospital beds carried no legal weight. The judge leaned forward, tapped the papers in front of her, and granted our motion for a temporary order appointing a corporate trustee to safeguard the assets until a final decision could be made. It was not victory, not yet, but it was a seismic shift. My mother no longer held the keys. When the gavel came down on that order, I felt a kind of hollow satisfaction, not because I had won, but because for the first time in years, she could not twist the levers without someone else watching. I saw her stiffen, saw Haley whisper furiously, saw Richard avoid my eyes, and I realized they had expected me to tire out, to crack, to lose momentum, but instead I had brought them into a room where control was no longer theirs. As we shuffled out, the clerk handed us papers and leaned down toward me, lowering her voice so that only I could hear. "Judge Shaw will take this," she said, nodding toward the docket. The name hit me like a jolt, because I remembered the mentorship clinic, the volunteer hours, the quiet conversations about community service. That connection had nothing to do with favoritism and everything to do with timing, because I knew that this was a judge who valued action over noise. The clerk slid a note across and whispered, "Judge Shaw will take this." I knew that name. The news that Judge Shaw would preside over the case unsettled my mother in a way I had never seen before, because she had built her entire life around controlling appearances, choosing the rooms where she could play queen and deciding who got to speak. But suddenly the person sitting at the center of this story was someone who had already known me in another setting, someone who had once seen me volunteer long hours without cameras, without recognition, and without needing to prove my worth to anyone, and although I never expected special treatment, I could tell that my mother understood how dangerous it was for her to face a judge who could not be manipulated by charm or crocodile tears. That realization pushed her into overdrive, and she began calling every friend she still had from church, every neighbor who had ever been invited to her holiday parties, and every cousin who might listen, feeding them a script where she was the long-suffering mother who had sacrificed endlessly for an ungrateful daughter who was now trying to humiliate her publicly. What she did not count on was the fact that paper always outlasts gossip, and I held the kind of paper she could not rewrite. I kept my responses minimal, but at a carefully chosen moment, I released something that was not a legal filing, not an affidavit, but a letter written years earlier by my grandmother in her own hand. In that letter, she had thanked me for helping with her medications, praised me for keeping her appointments in order, and, in words that still make my throat tighten, explained that she created the trust so that my life could be simple, safe, and free from begging. The letter was not a formal amendment, yet it was a statement of intent so powerful that no amount of spin could erase it. I did not send it with commentary or accusations. I simply attached it to an email addressed to the extended family with the subject line for context and let her own words carry the weight. Haley, of course, could not resist turning the whole dispute into an online drama. She posted pictures of herself crying in her car, railing against how envy poisons families, insisting that she was only ever trying to create something beautiful and that I had crushed her spirit. Her followers ate it up, showering her with sympathy, and for a moment I almost felt the pull of wanting to defend myself, but I reminded myself again that the courtroom is where this story would be decided, not in comment threads written by strangers. I documented everything, every post, every photo, every quote, and I sent them to Helen, who archived them as exhibits of behavior inconsistent with fiduciary responsibility. Behind the scenes, I decided to make a move that I knew would sting far more than any sarcastic rebuttal online. I drafted an offer to Haley, typed slowly, line by line, making sure it was polite and utterly reasonable. The offer was simple: a stipend for community college expenses administered under the same strict conditions that I had once agreed to follow, tied only to housing, health, and work requirements, monitored by the new corporate trustee. I sent it through Helen to ensure it was formally logged, and then I waited. Predictably, Haley refused immediately and chose instead to screenshot the offer and mock it online, presenting me as a control freak who wanted to ration her life. What she did not realize was that her refusal of such a reasonable offer only made her look reckless to the one audience that mattered most, the court. Meanwhile, my mother kept trying to craft the narrative that she was protecting family harmony, telling anyone who would listen that I was vindictive and that she had only tried to shield Haley from the cruelty of the world. But every time she repeated that story, she ran into the same wall. The documents said what they said, and the freeze order was still in place. Desperation pushed her to consider attacking me more directly, yet Helen reminded me of a weapon tucked neatly inside the trust itself, an interim clause, the kind of provision that warned any beneficiary that if they tried to contest the terms, they would forfeit their share. We filed a reminder with the court that this clause remained active, and the corporate trustee immediately acknowledged it, which meant that if my mother wanted to continue slinging mud and pushing stories that contradicted the trust, she risked blowing up her own position entirely. Watching the realization dawn on her face during the next hearing was a moment I will never forget, because for once, she had no script ready, no fake smile broad enough to cover the fear of losing everything. At the same time, I noticed how the social landscape around us shifted. Some relatives who had initially rushed to her defense grew quieter, unsure of what to say after seeing the letter from my grandmother and the bank's official freeze. Friends who had once reposted Haley's story started to pull them down, unwilling to be attached to something that might backfire. Even Richard, usually the silent partner in all of this, began sending me short messages trying to soften the tension, suggesting that I think about the long game and the family's reputation. I did not respond with anger. I simply wrote back one sentence: the family's reputation rests on honoring the document. That was enough to silence him, at least for a while. When the day came for our next major hearing, the courtroom atmosphere was charged. My mother walked in wearing the same polite expression she always used when she wanted to project composure, but her posture betrayed her, stiff and defensive. Haley followed close behind, trying to look sympathetic, but clearly rattled by the fact that her lifestyle pipeline had dried up. I did not have to say a word at that moment. Judge Shaw glanced up, looked me directly in the eye, and with the smallest hint of recognition that most of the room missed, she said my first name before beginning the session. It was not favoritism, Not special treatment, just acknowledgement that I was not the faceless caricature my mother had painted, but a real person she had once seen doing quiet work without needing applause. We walked into the courtroom, and Judge Shaw looked up, smiled very slightly, and said my first name. Walking into the courtroom that final morning felt like stepping onto ground that was no longer shifting beneath me, because for months I had lived inside a storm of rumors, affidavits, and veiled threats, yet now the storm had no more places to hide. And everything came down to words written on paper and the judgment of one person who would weigh them carefully without caring about tiers, appearances, or family titles. Judge Shaw began with a formality that instantly changed the atmosphere, stating for the record that she had once known me through a mentorship program, that we had crossed paths when I volunteered, and that both parties had the right to object if they believed this created bias. My mother looked as if she wanted to leap to her feet, but her attorney leaned over, whispering furiously, reminding her that objecting would not only look desperate, but would also risk bringing even more attention to the mentorship work that painted me in a light she had tried to erase. No one objected, so the proceedings continued, and with that small exchange, the ground tilted ever so slightly in my direction. Helen presented our case with the same deliberate calm she had maintained from the beginning, walking through each exhibit as if she were lining up puzzle pieces that all clicked neatly together. She began with the trust's original language, pointed to the clause forbidding any beneficiary from acting as trustee, then moved to the amendment confirming written directives only, and finally displayed the defective notarization on my mother's affidavit, which looked almost comical when placed under the scrutiny of court procedure. The judge asked one question: why had the notary been a longtime co-worker of Richard's? My mother's side stammered, and the silence filled the room louder than any accusation. The bank representative took the stand, opening thick folders with meticulous records. Page after page showed transactions that bore no resemblance to housing, health, or education, but instead outlined a trail of retreats, spa visits, boutique purchases, and event deposits. Each line was a paper cut, small on its own, but together they bled the credibility my mother had so carefully tried to preserve. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair, and for once she did not smile, because the ledger left no room for charm. When it was my turn to speak, I stood slowly, and instead of giving a speech or trying to sway anyone with emotional appeals, I said the simplest thing I could manage, that I was not asking to bankrupt my family, that I was not asking for punishment, that I only wanted the trust to be honored exactly as my grandmother had written it, with fairness and with protection against misuse. I told the judge that I had lived long enough being told to keep quiet, to avoid drawing lines, to accept scraps as though they were gifts, and that this was my one chance to insist that promises put into writing mattered more than anyone's opinions of my worth. The ruling, when it came, was not a dramatic explosion, but a series of deliberate sentences that stacked on top of one another until the final shape was undeniable. Judge Shaw ordered a full accounting to be completed, appointed the corporate trustee permanently, removed my mother from any role of authority, and required restitution for funds that had been spent outside the permitted categories. The order included educational support available to both me and Haley, but under the exact same conditions, meaning the days of unlimited access were gone forever. It was balanced, measured, and utterly devastating to my mother's illusion of control. Yet the part that mattered most to me was not the restitution or even the permanent appointment of the corporate trustee. It was the final request Helen and I made, one that we had kept quiet until the last possible moment, knowing that its impact would cut deeper than any financial order. We asked that a standing scholarship be created at the community college where my grandmother had once taken night classes, funded by the discretionary portion of the trust and named in her honor. We explained that this was not about punishment, but about legacy, about placing her name where it belonged, tied to opportunity and dignity rather than family warfare. The judge approved it without hesitation, and in order for it to proceed, my mother had to sign the consent as part of the public record. Watching her hand move across the page, forced to attach her name to something that cemented my grandmother's intent and stripped her of her false narrative, was the moment of justice I had been waiting for. After court adjourned, I gathered my papers slowly, not rushing, not celebrating outwardly, but allowing myself the quiet satisfaction of knowing that for once I had not been outmaneuvered, shouted down, or erased. Richard muttered an apology on the way out, a weak attempt at smoothing over what could never be smoothed, and I nodded without commitment, telling him only that I was finished keeping anyone's secrets. Haley brushed past me without meeting my eyes, her bravado drained, her phone clutched tightly like a lifeline to a world that had suddenly lost interest in her drama. My mother walked out stiffly, her face unreadable, but I could see the cracks that no amount of makeup or performance could cover anymore. In the days that followed, I expected to feel triumphant, to feel like victory would somehow heal the years of being dismissed, but what settled over me instead was something quieter, something steadier. I realized that the win did not fix the broken pieces of our family, and it did not erase the sting of being told I was not worth it, but it did something more important. It reminded me that I never again had to ask anyone for permission to be worth anything. The trust was safe, the scholarship was secured, and the power to define myself no longer belonged to people who thrived on tearing me down. I thought getting the money back would fix me. It didn't. It did something better. It made me stop asking permission to be worth it.